Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on research methodology in history. Today we will be learning about history and folklore. The relationship between history and folklore is complex and varied. To understand this issue, which has been discussed by many experts in different parts of the world, it is best for us to survey the existing scholarship on the subject. But even before that, we need to understand what folklore is, what is the scope of folklore studies as a discipline. Only after we are familiarized with these ideas can we take a look at the state of the discipline in India and abroad. So, what is folklore and folklore study? Folklore is an amorphous and ambiguous concept. Martha Sims and Martin Stephens have commented that folklore is what is studied by folklorists and the name of the discipline as well. They have emphasized that it is not primitive, old-fashioned or simple. It is more than just a form of literary study or even anthropology. While it has grown out of the study of literature and has its roots in anthropology, it is also connected with sociology, psychology, history, and literature, while also carrying elements of scripture, architecture, music, performing arts, and linguistics. Thus, it is situated at a unique junction between the social sciences and the humanities. Like all disciplines, it has evolved and changed. Richard Dawson has stated that folklorists are, and here I shall quote him, concerned with the study of traditional culture or the unofficial culture or the folk culture as opposed to the elite culture, not for the sake of proving a thesis, but to learn about the mass of humanity overlooked by conventional disciplines. Therefore, while folklore may borrow from other disciplines, where it differs is in its lens or the way of looking. Folklorists study everyday expressive communication. Folklore shares a very ambiguous relationship with culture. Its relationship with what is called high or elite culture appears to be quite clear and unequivocal. Folklore is not high culture. The culture that is institutionalized, taught, and propagated through official channels is not folklore. Folklore is not popular culture either. While it has more in common with popular culture than it has with high culture, most of the elements of popular culture don't fit precisely within folklore. However, the relationship is not so simple. Elements of high culture can be and have been spontaneously incorporated into folk traditions. Games, habits, and customs inspired by popular culture can inhabit folk spaces. The distinction lies not in the content, but rather how the content is used. Thus, while high and popular culture may be spread and imbibed primarily through institutions and the media, folklore and folk culture spread through personal collections, values, traditions, and beliefs. They're constructed at the ground level by everyday people as part of their everyday lives. Thus, if we have to define folklore, we can say that folklore is informally learned, unofficial knowledge about the world, ourselves, our communities, our beliefs, our cultures, and our traditions that is expressed creatively through words, music, customs, actions, behaviors, and materials. It is also the interactive, dynamic process of creating, communicating, and performing as we share that knowledge with other people. There are many types or genres of folklore. The primary division is threefold: verbal, material, and customary. Verbal folklore is any kind of lore involving words, whether they are set to music, arranged in the form of a story, or just expressions of beliefs. Urban legends are good examples of verbal folklore. Material folklore can be permanent, like architecture, or ephemeral, like food. Material objects may be handmade or even mass produced, but used in expressive or creative ways. Most often, the material culture is created for specific folk practices or events. The practice of quilting is a good example. Customary folklore is more ambiguous than the other two. In this context, custom is repeated patterned behavior within certain practices, such as secret handshakes for private clubs. Now we come to the study of folklore. The history of folklore study can explain how folklore became such a wide and varied field. The origin of folklore study lies in the Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when scholars imagined that the people of rural areas far away from the developing industrial civilization had closer touch with the natural and the spiritual. Thus, they romanticized these people as the folk and traveled to remote locations to search out and collect the fragments of the folk culture, which was thought to be pristine and original and connected to how human beings originally lived. So, in 18th century Germany, it was believed that the rural folk preserved the cultural heritage of Germany's Teutonic tribal origins. The scholars tried to document this vast array of historical folk knowledge and traditions. And the most well known of these were the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who collected folk stories and published them in the form of Grimm's fairy tales. This German approach was the example of a nationalist approach to folklore, as it concentrated on collecting fragments of a dying or almost lost culture to revitalize the current shared identity of the nation. The method popularized by the brothers Grimm was adopted in other countries as well. In England, William John Thoms modeled his own work after them, and he was the first to use the term folklore in 1846. English scholars were collecting texts and verbal traces from the countryside in the 19th century, and earlier this process had been known as the collection of popular antiquities. In the late 19th century, American scholars started a similar enterprise, though they were beginning to recognize that what they were collecting were more than just antiquities, but vital parts of the lives of the people that they were studying. One important development in folklore study was the emphasis on finding original texts. There was increasing awareness that stories, traditions, and texts had been conveyed in different forms through both time and space. Thus, there was great interest in locating folklore within particular cultural, ethnic, and social frameworks, and tracing the migration of texts through geographical areas and within social groups. At the root of this assumption was the persisting notion that folklore was simply the remnant of a vanishing past in need of preservation. There was also more theorization going on, with ideas like the solar mythology theory developed by Max Muller. This theory argued that all European folktale at their core developed from solar myths. This theory was even applied to non-European folktales. The turn of the 20th century saw increasing interest in the sharing and dissemination of folklore. Franz Boas explained this movement and transformation of texts through the process of diffusion and also emphasized the importance of culture. Alongside this work, scholars were also trying to catalogue folk tales by theme, character, plot, and other details to better trace their diffusion, and books like The Types of Folktale by Arne and Thompson and The Motif Index by Thompson became landmark works in the field. Transmission studies continued, with scholars trying to trace verbal transmission by framing criteria centering around narrative features. Albert Lord developed a complex system called the oral formulaic theory to aid in this attempt, and it remained an important item in the folklorists' toolkit. The 1930s saw the Federal Writers Project in the United States, where thousands of writers collected an enormous amount of stories, tales, songs, and idioms. This collection was organized under the supervision of Benjamin Botkin, who was the national folklore editor, and he had a strong influence on this mammoth project. The first half of the 20th century saw more detailed work in specific genres like folk song, proverbs, folk tales, and these huge collections were interpreted using theoretical paradigms from the social sciences. Like functionalism, we tried to understand the relation between folklore and the community, and structuralism, which broke a text down into parts and tried to understand the relationship between the parts and the whole. Linguists were also theorizing about ways of listening and verbal expressions. The 1960s and the 1970s saw the convergence of folklore studies with linguistics. Scholars were not just looking at the structure of the language, but also at how communication itself was taking place. Thus, there was a movement away from the content of the text to the contextual nature of the performance of the texts. Interaction between performers and between performers and the audience became more important, and this foregrounded the importance of context and setting. That is, the places and situations in which the performances were taking place. A more symbolic view of performance emerged, and this enabled the exploration of the ways in which communication patterns reveal beliefs, traditions, and values. This emphasis on the performance aspect helped to establish the core of the discipline as the study of artistic expression in groups and contexts. However, some scholars argued that performance studies were too narrow a focus that ignored broader socio-cultural contexts, as well as women's folklore and non-verbal texts. Women folklorists pointed out the long-standing emphasis on the folklore of men, where the folklore of women was only considered in relation to the folklore of men. Thus, there was an increasing emphasis on studying women's folklore in their own right. Thus, folklore studies clearly have had a long, complicated, and varied history. However, now we must try to trace how history itself has interacted with folklore. So, we shall be undertaking a historiographical study of history and folklore. The disciplines of history and folklore studies have had a long history of interaction. To better understand the changing relationships between these two fields, we will be looking at this matter in three stages. So now, the first stage of this relationship, which can be categorized as harmony. This stage lasted from 1846, when the term folklore was first used, as has been referred to above before, to the 1920s. History and folklore enjoyed a close relationship. In Britain, Sir James Fraser, who was an extremely versatile scholar, being adept at history, anthropology, folklore, and the classics, published several works, including Golden Bough in 1890 and Folklore in the Old Testament in 1918. Another English scholar published Folklore as a Historical Science in 1908. Both of these were preceded by Wald und Feldkult, published by the German scholar Wilhelm Mannhardt in 1875. The Historical Geographical School in Finland was studying variations in folk tales across space and time as well. One reason for this harmony was softer disciplinary boundaries. The German scholar Wilhelm Heinrich Riehl was both a socio-cultural historian and folklorist. A similar scholar was Frederick Troels Lund of Denmark, whose 14-volume study of material culture and daily life of Denmark and Norway was published from 1879. At the same time, throughout Scandinavia, in Oslo, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, open-air museums were being built, and these were directly inspired by the folk costume display at the Paris exhibition of 1867. One thing that needs to be remembered, however, is that at this time, when history itself was being professionalized, it was still very state-centric. And thus, these socio-cultural histories that were interacting with and maintaining close relationship with folklore studies were seen as marginal. Troels Lund's huge 14-volume work was thus dismissed by German historian Dietrich Schaefer for dealing with trivialities. However, some historians at least were prepared to have close relations with folklore. The second stage can be categorized as suspicion. This period from the 1920s to the 1970s saw an estrangement between folklore and history. This was a time when disciplinary boundaries were sharpening. Sociology and anthropology were devising their own methods to study the present, and history was firmly oriented towards the past. In England, anthropology entirely eclipsed folklore, which became relegated to an amateur practice. The situation was somewhat different in other countries like Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the United States. Here, folklore emerged as a distinct professional discipline concentrating on the present. Due to the presence of the Historical Geographical School in Finland, Helsinki had a chair of folklore as early as 1886. Folklorists met and interacted at international conferences, and with increasing professionalization, we see a change in vocabulary, many now choosing to refer to themselves as ethnographers. In Germany, the term Vok itself had become tarnished due to its association with the Nazis. Even in this time of estrangement, some scholars tried to bridge the disciplinary gap. The Dutch cultural historian Johan Huizinga researched into popular beliefs. In France in the 1930s, Lucien Febvre one of the founding members of the famous Annals School of History, emphasized the need for history to learn from folklore. In Brazil, Gilberto Freire referred favorably to the potential contributions of folklore in his preface to his History of the Patriarchal Family. The famous British philosopher and theorist of history R. G. Collingwood wrote on the same theme, though these writings were only discovered posthumously. Scholars who were already walking the boundary between disciplines, like Ernesto de Martino, Julia Cara Baroja, and E. Estin Evans, were also expressing interest in working with both folklore and history. And now we come to the third stage, which can be seen as reconciliation. This stage is from the 1970s to the present day, where we see a major change in attitude regarding the relationship between history and folklore. The trends of history from below and history of popular culture revitalize historical interest in folklore studies. This is demonstrated in the works of historians like Jacques Le Goff, who expressed interest in folk culture and working with folklorists, and his student Jean-Claude Schmitt, who worked extensively with folk tales and legends from the medieval period and referred in detail to the works of folklorists like Thomson, Propp, and Bausinger. Another historian who adopted the means and methods of folklore was Leroy Ladurie. His History of Money, Love and Death in 18th century Languedoc, based on a romance contextualized with folktale studies done by famous folklorists, clearly demonstrated how history and folklore could be used together for new kinds of scholarship. In British history, Peter Burke's work on popular culture from the 16th to the 18th centuries and the use of famous folklorists like Giuseppe Cocchiara, Paul Delarue, Vladimir Propp, and Carl von Sydow was another indication of the steadily increasing acceptance of folklore by historians. British historians working on the history of the calendar, like Charles Fithian Adams and Ronald Hutton, took their cues from folklore studies, with Hutton working specifically on a ritual calendar. This expression of interest was a two-way process, with folklorists also adopting historical methods in their works. Richard Dawson, David Buchan, and his work on the Scottish ballads, Roger Abraham's study of Afro-American traditions, Henry Glass's book on the folklore and history of an Ulster community, Thomas Hofer's work on Hungary, and Jonas Frickman and Oliver Lofgren's work on Sweden are all good examples. Some of these have become quite well known, often being termed as historical anthropology, but they're centrally about the European folklore tradition. Through the use of sociocultural theory is quite prominent. The academic causes behind this reconciliation are a series of interdisciplinary changes that history itself went through. The social history of the 1960s gave rise to microhistory and history of everyday life, which were in practice, method, and tone quite close to historical anthropology. Subsequently came the cultural turn, which increased the importance of material culture in historical research. It essentially afforded a place where historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, and other disciplinary experts could meet, leading to the blurring of interdisciplinary boundaries and the increasing popularity and acceptance of interdisciplinarity. Another factor behind this reconciliation between folklore and history and the increasing acceptance of the methods of folklore studies was the increasing popularity of oral history and social memory in historical research. Such research inevitably focused on oral transmission, oral testimony, and oral culture. And historians of this field had to slowly learn folkloric elements like stereotype and myth and be able to detect folk tales. In a way, they were treading a path very familiar to folklorists, as history came to understand the importance and utility of the methods of folklore studies. Now we will take a very brief look at folklore outside Europe, namely in India. It is important and instructive to look at folklore studies from a non-European perspective. Professor Birendaranath Dutta has pointed out how folklore study has been in vogue in India from the ancient period itself. He argues that in Indian culture, folk customs or lokachar have always been distinguished from the customs of elite society prescribed by the scriptures, which are known as shastrachar. In the history of Indian drama, folk performances were called lokodharmi to distinguish them from the elite level of performance, or the nattodharmi, which followed the prescriptions of the Natto Shastra. Also, in a huge country like India, the regional or the local were always distinguished from the high level and the national. And thus the local was sometimes called Deshi, while the national was called Margi. It is extremely important to note that this type of division was in vogue from the most ancient times in India, indicating that people were not only aware of folk culture as a distinct entity, but that sufficient space was afforded it within the existing cultural paradigm so it could manifest its own unique features. Thus, the practice of collecting and compiling folk tales was already in vogue in ancient India, with collections like the Panchatantra, the Kathacharit Sagar, the Hitopadayish, the Betal Panchabinshati, and the Buddhist Jatakas were being famous examples. The colonial period inaugurated a new phase in the history of Indian folklore. Once German scholars like Grimm and Max Muller had announced that Indian and German mythology were connected, there was a concerted effort to study Indian folk tales and myths in Sanskrit. Also in Arabian and Persian by European scholars who knew very little about India. The next stage of this study consisted of numerous field studies carried out by British officials and Christian missionaries. After this, Western scholars with very little Indian involvement carried out both fieldwork as well as philological research. But this was also the period of Indian nationalism, where rising patriotic sentiments encouraged Indians to once again take an active interest in folk culture and folklore. With the encouragement of people like Rabindranath Tagore, Kaka Saheb Kalelkar, Zaved Chand Meghani, and Lakshminath Bezborua, efforts to collect and publish India's immense wealth of folk culture flourished. From the 1950s, anthropologists and linguists joined the field of folklore study, while universities inaugurated programs for the study of and research into folklore. The final phase came in the 1980s, when, with increasing international collaboration, new methods, concepts, and skills came to be employed in folklore research, thus changing the field once again. And now we can come to our conclusion. Thus, it has become clear through this discussion that history and folklore have much in common which can benefit both disciplines. The recent broadening of the scope of history and the increasing popularity of disciplinary elements like cultural or oral history has made room for interdisciplinary collaborations. It has been seen that such collaborations easily demonstrate the viability of new and innovative methods in historical research adopted from folklore. Both disciplines essentially have tried and are trying to understand and document the socio-cultural endeavors of humanity. While they may have different areas of focus and in some cases may have different ways of doing research, they share enough in common to be valuable disciplinary allies. Thank you.